April 13th, 1861 AD, the Battle of Fort Sumter. On April 13th, 1861, the Battle of Fort Sumter ended. It also marked the beginning of the American Civil War. The fortress, which was located on an island off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, controlled the entrance to the city's harbor. Before the battle began, the government of South Carolina, which was the first state to withdraw from the United States on December 20th, 1860, demanded that the Federal troops of the United States Army leave the Charleston harbor at once. The soldiers were moved to Fort Sumter because of their commanding officer. Major Robert Anderson felt their soldiers would be much safer at Sumter because it was well fortified compared to the smaller Fort Moultrie, which was abandoned and occupied by the Confederate Army. Even though it was visually impressive, Fort Sumter was only 90% completed due to budget cuts. It wasn't well stocked for the winter, and it was severely unmanned with only 85 soldiers there to occupy a fortress that was built for 650. It was armed with 60 cannons out of the 135 it was designed for, but only a handful could be fired due to a lack of manpower. The Confederate Army was led by General P.G.T. Beauregard, one of the few non-scummy people of the Confederacy who was also a brilliant military mind, and he knew the weakness of the fort, and with over 6,000 soldiers on hand, he planned to bomb Fort Sumter into submission. Before shelling the fortress on April 11th, he sent aides with letters demanding the surrender of the fort. A week before the battle, Major Anderson pleaded with the federal government to send supplies and, if possible, more soldiers because the situation in Fort Sumter was looking grim. On April 12th, he replied to Beauregard's formal surrender letter by saying, "I shall await the first shot, and if you do not batter us to pieces, we shall be starved out in a few days." Beauregard's reply to Anderson was, "If you state the time which you will evacuate Fort Sumter, and agree in the meantime that you will not use your guns against us unless ours shall be employed against Fort Sumter, we will abstain from opening fire upon you." Major Anderson said that he would evacuate Fort Sumter by noon, April 15th, unless he received new orders from his government or supplies. James Chestnut, Beauregard's go-between in the surrender negotiations, told Anderson, "Sir, by authority of Brigadier General Beauregard, commanding the provisional forces of the Confederate States, we will have the honor to notify you that he will open fire of his batteries on Fort Sumter in 1 hour from this time." Anderson walked back the negotiators to their boat and said, "If we never meet in this world again, God grant that we may meet in the next." An hour later, at 4:30 a.m., the first shell was launched from the abandoned Fort Moultrie, which served as the Confederates' bombardment position over Fort Sumter. Moultrie's ammunition was low because most of it was in Fort Sumter, so the rest of the shelling took place from other artillery batteries located around the Charleston harbor. The Confederate Army shelled the fortress all night long. Anderson didn't order a counter-firing until dawn. All the next day, the fighting continued. The relief ships that were promised could not land because of the fort's difficult location, and the counter-firing had to be stopped on several occasions because they ran out of cloth gunpowder bags that were needed to load the cannons, so they had to make them out of socks. The next day, around 1 p.m. on April 13th, Confederate Colonel Louis Wigfall waved a white handkerchief from his sword as he approached the fort from his boat and said to Major Anderson, "You have defended your flag nobly, sir. You have done all that is possible to do, and General Beauregard wants to stop this fight. On what terms will you evacuate this fort?" Major Anderson, with dwindling ammunition for his cannons, no food, and several fires that dotted the fortress due to the Confederates firing heated cannonballs, he had no other choice but to officially surrender Fort Sumter at 2:30 p.m. with no loss from either side. However, during the 100-gun salute that Anderson negotiated as part of the surrender that was given, sparks from it set off a discarded pile of cartridges, which killed U.S. Army Private Daniel Huff, who was forever known as the first casualty of the American Civil War. The Confederate Army now occupied the damaged fortress and would hold on to it until the end of the war. But Robert Anderson, the U.S. Army major who commanded Fort Sumter, would return to the fortress on April 14, 1865, now a Union general, have the honor to raise the American flag once again at Fort Sumter. The Confederate victory at Fort Sumter would be used as a military recruitment aid on both sides, as many volunteers would join the Army. This would be the beginning of a bloody civil war in the United States, which wouldn't end until 5 years later, costing hundreds of thousands of lives and divide the country for decades to come.